So you want your youth ministry to be gospel-centered. Who doesn't? In the midst of today's youth ministry culture, everyone talks about being gospel-centered, about being Jesus-centered, about reclaiming the gospel in their ministries. But there's still a lot of confusion about what that even means. And so this is how I think about it, that there are three types of approaches that your ministry can take towards the gospel. The first is that you can be gospel absent, right? That there are some ministries where the gospel is just absent. Maybe this is a more liberal view of Christianity, where the gospel isn't really that important, where Jesus is just one among many gods. Usually this is a kind of a Christian universalism type of approach that says that we believe in Jesus. Other people believe in the four spiritual laws of the Buddha, or they have other spiritualities, and that's all good and that's all fine. And in the end, God will save everyone depending on their pathway to salvation. So some people are gospel absent because they fundamentally reject the necessity of believing the gospel. Others of us, which I think is more common, we are gospel absent because we're so focused on trying to help students, we're so focused on trying to be relevant and helpful and practical, that we give students a lot of how-tos, right? How to live your best life, how to be a great friend, how to have good relationships, how to be a good student, how to find happiness. And lots of these how-tos are filled with things that students are supposed to do. And the gospel is not a law. The gospel is not a list of how-tos. The gospel is the proclamation of what God has done. And so the gospel isn't something that we do. The gospel is something that we receive. And so if you're constantly giving your students a list of things to do, as helpful as that might be, and as important as that is in different areas of ministry, if you are focused on giving students tools and resources and guidelines and whatever for how to live a better life, then your ministry might actually be gospel absent, because you are not proclaiming the work of God for students' lives. Most commonly, however, I think the second approach to the gospel is kind of youth ministry's default, and that's to have a gospel present ministry. So the first is gospel absent. The second is gospel present. Here's what I mean by that, is that you preach the gospel, but it's mostly an evangelism tool. Right, the gospel is present in your ministry when you're inviting students to bring their friends, when you have retreats, when you have more evangelistic type of events, and occasionally, sprinkled in throughout your youth ministry, you remind students of the narrow gospel of Jesus Christ. And so in one of the previous videos, we've talked about what is the gospel and how the two senses of the gospel, the narrow gospel and the broader gospel. And so I want to encourage you to check that out. But if you're only focused on the narrow gospel about the cross and the resurrection and not the overarching story of God's rescue for humanity, then your ministry is probably gospel present. So the gospel is not absent. You're not heretics. You're not leading students away from the gospel, but you're preaching the gospel in a way that that can lead students to think that the gospel is for non-Christians, but Christians then have to try harder and work harder in order to follow God. And the third approach then is to be gospel-centered. To embrace the gospel as evangelism, and to embrace the gospel for discipleship, to understand this broader sense of the gospel of creation, the fall, redemption, of glorification, of giving students a gospel-shaped worldview in which they live. So your ministry is shaped from the gospel in the way you play games, the way you recruit and train leaders, the way you disciple students, the way you equip and empower students to be leaders in the ministry and in your church and in the community, the way you do service projects and missions trips, the way you engage in social media, the way you counsel students when they have just fallen flat on their face, whether it with porn or lies or gossip or any sorts of other issues, that you constantly are bringing the gospel of God's grace and God's saving love to students and helping them understand what God has done for them, and that our actions is a response to God's first action, right? That we live in response to the gospel. We don't just give kids a list of how-tos. We are constantly feeding students the gospel, both in evangelism and in discipleship and in laughter and in tears. And so I want to encourage you to think through your own approach to the gospel, whether or not it's in your own heart or in your own family or in your own ministry. Are you gospel absent, either intentionally by rejecting the necessity of the gospel, or are you implicitly gospel absent by just trying to be so helpful and trying to be so relevant that you've forgotten to proclaim the gospel as God's work of salvation? Or have you become gospel present, where you've kind of come to see the gospel mostly for non-Christians? It's mostly an evangelism tool. Or are you gospel-centered, and you are looking for ways to feed a gospel-shaped worldview into every element and aspect of your ministry to students? And so I would love to talk with you more. Feel free to look me up and send me a message. I also want to encourage you to look into the Rooted Ministry. Rootedministry.com is their website. It's a ministry that has really helped me understand what gospel-shaped youth ministry looks like, and I'd encourage you to check them out.